The history of the 11th century is often written as a post-mortem, a slow expiration of Roman power under the weight of its own antiquity. Yet, in the spring of 1071, the view from the walls of Constantinople was not of despair, but of a calculated muscular resurgence. Driven by this necessity for a definitive restoration, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes did not inherit a corpse. He inherited a machine that had merely grown rusty from the political intrigues of the civil aristocracy. The collective psychological state of the empire was characterized by a desperate, aggressive nostalgia, a belief that the frontiers of Basil II could be reclaimed if only the state returned to its martial roots. Romanos, a seasoned general from the Cappadocian military elite, embodied this spirit. He was a man who understood that the survival of the Byzantine world depended on the professionalization of its borders, leading to a massive mobilization that was as much a political statement as it was a military maneuver. Consequently, the host that Romanos assembled was not the desperate levy of a dying state, but perhaps the most diverse and professional force the medieval world had seen in a generation. Forensic evidence from contemporary chroniclers like Michael Adelaites reveals a logistical complexity that defies the narrative of decline. The imperial registers recorded a force numbering in the tens of thousands, comprising the elite Tagmata regiments of the capital, heavy Frankish cavalry under Roussel de Bayeul, and the feared Varangian Guard, whose long-handled axes were already legendary across the eastern Mediterranean. This was a force of staggering variety, including Pecheneg horse archers and Norman mercenaries, all bound together by the gold of the imperial treasury and the singular will of the emperor. The sheer scale of the baggage train, hauling sophisticated siege engines across the rugged Anatolian interior, indicated a campaign designed for permanent conquest rather than a mere punitive raid. While the Romans marched east with the intent of crushing the Seljuk threat, the Sultan Alp Arslan was looking in the opposite direction. For the Seljuk leadership, the Byzantine frontier was a secondary concern, a nuisance compared to the existential ideological struggle against the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. Alp Arslan was not a conqueror seeking to dismantle the Roman Empire. He was a strategic pragmatist who viewed Anatolia as a buffer zone rather than a primary objective. Inevitably, this misalignment of intentions created a dangerous friction. The Sultan had spent the previous months campaigning in the Levant, his eyes fixed on Aleppo and Cairo, and he viewed the Roman advance with genuine frustration. To him, the massive Byzantine host was an interruption of a more important war, a distraction that forced him to turn his back on the Fatimids to address a threat he had hoped to contain through diplomacy. The march itself was a masterpiece of 11th century logistics, yet it carried the seeds of its own undoing. As the army moved through the Anatolian themes, the strain of maintaining such a massive professional host began to show. A weather report from that specific season suggests a dry, punishing heat that wore down the heavily armored cataphracts. Among the thousands who marched was a young soldier from the Thracian theme, a man whose name is lost to time, but whose experience was typical of the rank and file. Having spent 3 years' wages on his equipment, he marched not for the glory of the empire, but out of a professional obligation to a system that had protected his family's land for generations. His world was not of grand strategy, but of the weight of his shield and the constant search for clean water in the arid highlands. The fragility of history became manifest when Romanos reached the vicinity of Lake Van. Here, the emperor made a decision that would haunt the Byzantine state for centuries. He split his forces. Believing the Sultan was still far to the south, Romanos sent a significant portion of his army, including his elite infantry and the Frankish cavalry,
towards Kliat to secure supplies and scout the Seljuk positions. This was the moment where chance intervened. Had the Roman scouts been more diligent, or had the Sultan's movements been less rapid, the two halves of the Byzantine army might have remained united. Instead, Romanos arrived at the plains of Manzikert with a diminished force, unaware that the Sultan had performed a grueling forced march to meet him. The Sultan, still hoping to avoid a full-scale confrontation, sent an embassy to offer peace terms. Driven by the belief that he held the superior hand, Romanos rejected the offer. The atmosphere in the Roman camp on the eve of the battle was of tense professional confidence. There was no sense of impending doom, but rather the quiet focus of men who believed in the inevitability of their success. The forensic reality of the encampment, the sharpening of swords, the blessing of the standards, the meticulous checking of horse tack, pointed to an army that expected to win. The psychological state of the Seljuks, by contrast, was one of religious fervor and the grim determination of the underdog. Alp Arslan famously dressed in white, a symbolic shroud, signaling his readiness to die on the field. This contrast in morale would prove decisive. The Roman army was a professional machine that required cohesion to function. The Seljuk force was a fluid, motivated host that thrived on the very chaos that a large, multi-ethnic army feared most. Inevitably, the battle was decided not by a lack of Roman courage, but by a catastrophic failure of communication and the resurgence of internal political rivalries. When the order to retreat was misunderstood by the rearguard, the cohesion of the imperial host vanished in an instant. The very diversity that made the army powerful became its greatest liability, as different contingents, speaking different languages and harboring different loyalties, reacted to the confusion in isolation. Had the rearguard commander, Andronicus Ducas, remained loyal instead of withdrawing his troops to secure his family's political future in Constantinople, the center might have held. The tragedy of Manzikert was that the Roman state was powerful enough to win, but its leadership was too fractured to survive the pressure of the moment, leading to a defeat that was neither militarily inevitable nor strategically necessary. The legacy of that afternoon on the plains of Manzikert remains etched into the map of the modern world. The collapse of the Anatolian frontier, which followed not from the battle itself, but from the civil war that erupted in its aftermath, shifted the center of gravity for the Greek world forever. The loss of the central Anatolian plateau deprived the empire of its primary recruiting ground and its breadbasket, forcing it to look increasingly towards the west for survival. This dependency would eventually lead to the Crusades and the irreversible entanglement of Eastern and Western Christendom. Today, the silent ruins of the fortress at Manzikert stand as a testament to a moment when a powerful state, at the peak of its ambition, misunderstood the stability of its own foundations, changing the course of history through a series of small, avoidable choices made in the heat of a single summer.
By the mid-11th century, the Byzantine Empire existed in a state of precarious duality, a civilization whose external majesty masked a terminal internal rot. The golden domes of Constantinople, gleaming with the reflected light of the Bosporus, stood as a monument to a world that believed its own administrative brilliance could supersede the brutal realities of the frontier. Driven by a deep-seated fear of military coups, the civil bureaucracy in the capital had systematically dismantled the theme system, the once sturdy backbone of provincial defense that had sustained the empire for 4 centuries. Inevitably, this policy of domestic containment eroded the very borders it was meant to protect, as the landed military aristocracy was stripped of its influence in favor of a central government that viewed a successful general as a greater threat than a foreign invader.
The empire was gripped by a psychological paralysis, caught between the memory of an eternal Roman order and the practical decay of its garrisons. Consequently, the defense of the realm was no longer the duty of a landed citizenry, but a commodity purchased on the open market, turning the imperial army into a fragile mosaic of competing interests. In the damp, cramped offices of the Great Palace, a ledger from the year 1068 reveals the forensic reality of this decline, documenting the conversion of military service obligations into cash payments. These funds were not reinvested into the walls of the East, but were instead swallowed by a courtly culture obsessed with theological debate and the preservation of an ossified hierarchy. This era was defined by a profound cynicism. The urban elite, led by the influential Ducas family, believed that the empire's survival could be negotiated through diplomacy or bought by debased gold. They viewed the Anatolian plateau not as the empire's heartland, but a distant, dusty province whose rough-hewn defenders were a political liability. This disconnect created a dangerous vacuum of authority. As the Seljuk Turks began their tentative probes into the Armenian highlands, the response from Constantinople was not a mobilization of the themes, but a series of contradictory decrees that left the frontier commanders without men, money, or clear instructions. The spirit of the times was an elegant decay, where the refinement of the capital was directly funded by the vulnerability of the provinces. The transition from a citizen soldier to a mercenary-dependent force introduced a volatile new chemistry to the Roman military machine. By the time Romanos IV Diogenes took the throne, the imperial vanguard was a babel of tongues, comprising Frankish knights, Pecheneg horse archers, and Uzes mercenaries. These men were governed by the cold logic of the contract rather than the ancient call of Roman identity. Driven by this reliance on foreign steel, the emperor found himself commanding a force that was technically proficient but ideologically hollow. The Frankish commander, Roussel de Bayeul, a man whose loyalty was as sharp and as treacherous as his blade, epitomized this new reality. To Roussel and his peers, the Byzantine emperor was not a sacred sovereign, but a wealthy paymaster whose desperation provided an opportunity for personal enrichment. Inevitably, the presence of these mercenaries exacerbated the friction within the camp, as the few remaining native regiments viewed their foreign counterparts with a mixture of professional envy and cultural disdain. The logistical brilliance of the Roman past was now a hollow shell, struggling to feed a multi-ethnic host that had no shared language and no common cause. Consider the perspective of a man like Leo, a former soldier from the Anatolic theme, who in the summer of 1070 found himself laboring as a tenant on land his grandfather had once owned outright. His family's military grant had been seized by a court official in a legal maneuver common to the era, leaving him to watch as a column of Pecheneg mercenaries rode past his fields to defend a border he was no longer allowed to protect. His resentment was not merely personal, it reflected the broader collapse of the social contract that had held the empire together during its darkest hours. When the call to arms finally came for the Manzikert campaign, men like Leo were absent, replaced by expensive foreigners who had no stake in the soil they were paid to guard. This erosion of the middle class was the silent engine of the empire's military failure. The army that marched toward the east was a hollowed-out giant, possessing the armor and the titles of the Caesars, but lacking the communal will that had once made the Roman infantry an unbreakable wall. The march across the Anatolian plateau was a masterpiece of logistical strain and political sabotage. As the columns stretched for miles across the sun-scorched earth, the command structure began to fracture under the weight of the Ducas family's machinations. Andronicus Ducas, a man whose primary loyalty was to his family's bid to the throne rather than the emperor's victory, held a key position in the rearguard. He and his faction viewed a victory for Romanos as a catastrophe for their own domestic influence. A victorious emperor would return with the prestige necessary to crush the bureaucracy. Consequently, the tactical decisions made on the march were often influenced more by the desire to see Romanos fail than the need to defeat the Turks. The air in the officers' tents was thick with the scent of unlit incense and the heavier weight of unspoken treason. Every order was scrutinized for its political implications, and every delay was celebrated by those who sought the emperor's ruin. This internal friction slowed the army to a crawl, allowing the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan to choose the ground for the coming confrontation. Had Romanos IV chosen to spend another year training the native levies instead of rushing to a decisive battle with a fractured coalition, the history of the Near East might have been written in Greek rather than Turkish. The fragility of the moment was absolute. A single season of preparation could have restored the cohesion of the themes. Instead, the emperor felt the pressure of the ticking clock in Constantinople, knowing that every day he was away from the capital, his enemies were sharpening their knives. He was forced to gamble on a single, massive confrontation to secure his legitimacy. This desperation led to the fatal decision to split his forces, sending a significant portion of his best troops towards Chliat while he proceeded with the remainder to Manzikert. It was a choice born of poor intelligence and a lack of trust in his own subordinates. The resulting isolation of the imperial corps was the final link in a chain of errors that had begun decades earlier in the comfortable corridors of the great palace. The legacy of this internal fracture is visible in the very geography of the modern world. The collapse of the Byzantine shield at Manzikert did not just end a dynasty, it fundamentally shifted the cultural and religious boundaries of Eurasia, turning the Anatolian heartland into a springboard for the eventual rise of the Ottoman Empire. The border that moved from the Taurus Mountains to the shores of the Aegean during this period remains one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in human history. It serves as a sober reminder that the greatest threat to a civilization is rarely the enemy at the gate, but the slow, deliberate erosion of the institutions that give its people a reason to stand together. The silence that fell on the Anatolian plains after the battle was the sound of a 1,000-year-old shield finally shattering, its pieces scattered by the hands of the very men entrusted with its care.
The 11th century Byzantine Empire existed in a terminal anxiety. The golden era of Basil II had faded, replaced by a civilian aristocracy that viewed its military with suspicion. To the bureaucrats, a victorious general was a greater threat than a foreign invader. Consequently, the ascent of Romanos IV Diogenes was not a restoration of strength, but a provocation. Romanos was a soldier emperor who understood the borders were bleeding, yet he marched toward Manzikert in August 1071 with a knife pressed against his back. The psychological state of the era was of deep fragmentation, where survival was secondary to dynastic lineage. This internal rot meant the army Romanos led was not a singular instrument of will, but a fragile coalition of guards, disgruntled levies, and mercenaries whose loyalties were as thin as the chilling mountain air. Suspicion was the true currency of the capital. The campaign was documented by the historian Mikhail Atalaiates, who recorded the growing unease in the camp. As the Armeni host moved eastward, logistics frayed under the Armenian heat. A surviving inventory from the baggage train suggests a force weighed down by courtly luxuries, contrasting with the mobile Seljuk Tumans. Romanos, seeking a victory to silence critics, divided his forces, a decision that would haunt him. The earth near Manzikert became the stage for a confrontation that was, for the Sultan Alp Arslan, a necessity.
The Sultan had been focused on the Fatimids and offered a truce, which Romanos rejected. Inevitably, this set the two powers on a course collision, where the emperor sought total victory to secure his throne, while the Sultan fought for his empire's survival. The stakes were nothing less than the future of the East. On August 26th, the Byzantine heavy infantry formed a shining wall of iron. Their discipline was impeccable, a testament to the Roman tactica. Against them, Seljuk horse archers deployed in a crescent, utilizing the vastness of the plains. They did not charge, they swirled. Arrows fell in volleys, designed to exhaust the Roman line. The heat became a weight. Dust rose in plumes, creating a literal fog of war that mirrored the political opacity of the Roman command. The Byzantine center, led by the emperor, began a slow advance. They pushed the Turkish cavalry back for miles, but it was a hollow progress. The Seljuks were not retreating in defeat. They were drawing the heavy infantry away from support, stretching the line until the tension became unbearable. Every step forward was a step toward a meticulously prepared trap. As shadows lengthened, the discipline of the wings faltered. The right wing, composed of Armeniacan troops, struggled to maintain contact with the center. This gap was what Alp Arslan had waited for. Driven by exhaustion and darkness, Romanos signaled for the army to return to camp. It was a maneuver requiring synchronization. However, the signal was misinterpreted or ignored. The moment the emperor's standard turned, the psychological fragility of the army manifested as panic. The retreat was seen by the wings not as a withdrawal, but as a collapse. Consequently, the cohesion that had defined the Roman military dissolved, leaving the emperor's central division isolated on a rising swell of ground surrounded by Turkish steel. The silence from the flanks was the sound of a falling empire. The catastrophe became absolute through the deliberate and cold silence of Andronikos Doukas. As reserve commander, Doukas held the power to stabilize the line. He watched the chaos from safety. Had he moved his troops forward, the retreat could have been managed. Instead, Doukas saw an opportunity to settle a political score. He did not order the charge. Instead, he turned his horse and spread a rumor. The emperor was dead. This was no accidental failure. It was an act of treason intended to ensure the downfall of a rival. The reserve force followed their commander in flight, leaving Romanos and his guard to face the full weight of the Sultan's army alone. The conflict mode took over with a terrifying and sudden velocity. Seljuk cavalry closed the circle. Short, brutal exchanges replaced the archery. In this maelstrom stood a Varangian named Harald, whose axe had been passed down through 3 generations. He stood over a fallen comrade, his world reduced to the earth he defended. He would never see the fjords of his youth. Beside him, Romanos IV fought with a desperation that transcended his office. His horse butchered, his sword arm wounded, he refused to yield. The emperor was recognized by his purple buskins and dragged from the dead. For the first time, a Roman Caesar was a prisoner of war, his face pressed into the dust he had sought to conquer. Aftermath was a scene of dignity. When Romanos was brought before Alp Arslan, the Sultan asked what the emperor would do if positions were reversed. Romanos replied he would have killed the Sultan or paraded him in chains. Arslan, showing mercy that was the insult, replied he would do neither, granting freedom for a treaty and ransom. However, the damage was irreparable. The betrayal of Doukas had shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. The professional corps of the army was gone, and the civil war following Romanos's release ensured no reinforcements would ever hold the Anatolian plateau against the incoming Turkic migration. The consequences of Manzikert rippled across centuries, altering Western civilization. The loss of Anatolia forced Emperor Alexios Komnenos to appeal to the West for aid. This plea, born of the vacuum created by Ducas's treason, served as the catalyst for the First Crusade. The religious map was redrawn. The transformation of Asia Minor into a Turkic power base was the result of the rearguard's refusal to march. Today, geopolitical tensions and the borders of the Turkish Republic find their origins in the dust of 1071. The silence of Andronikos Dukas remains history's most haunting echo, a reminder that the collapse of great powers begins from within, where personal ambition overrides collective survival.
The dust of Manzikert had not yet settled when the Roman Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was led, mud-stained and trembling, into the presence of Sultan Alp Arslan. This moment, captured in the amber of 11th century chronicles, represented a fracture in the established order of the world, yet the immediate aftermath suggested a restoration rather than a collapse. For a week, the two most powerful men in the Near East shared a tent, engaging in a dialogue that bypassed the traditional theatrics of conquest. Alp Arslan, a leader whose strategic vision was fixed firmly on the Fatimid Caliphate to the south, viewed the Byzantine Empire not as a victim for the blade, but as a necessary buffer. Driven by this pragmatism, the Sultan's treatment of his captive was characterized by a chivalry that bordered on the surreal. He did not demand the emperor's head, instead he offered his hand. This surprising path to stability was paved with an unprecedented dignity, as the Sultan famously asked what Romanos would do if the roles were reversed. When Romanos admitted he would likely have his rival killed or paraded in chains, Arslan replied with the quiet authority of a man who understood the weight of history. "My religion precludes me from such cruelty." Inevitably, this personal rapport translated into a diplomatic framework that could have altered the trajectory of the medieval world. The resulting treaty of 1071 was a document of remarkable leniency, a forensic blueprint for imperial survival. It stipulated a ransom of 1.5 million gold pieces, a staggering sum, yet one the wealthy Byzantine bureaucracy could have absorbed, alongside an annual tribute and a marriage alliance between their children. Most significantly, the territorial concessions were limited to the border fortresses of Edessa, Hierapolis, and Manzikert itself. The vast, fertile interior of Anatolia, the empire's demographic heartland, and the source of its finest cavalry, remained untouched. Had this treaty been honored, the Byzantine frontier would have stabilized into a managed tributary state, securing the eastern flank and allowing the Romans to refocus their dwindling resources on the rising Norman threat in the west. The fragility of this moment cannot be overstated. The survival of the Greek East depended entirely on the word of a captive emperor and the patience of a nomadic sultan who preferred trade routes to ruins. However, the psychological state of Constantinople in the autumn of 1071 was not of strategic reflection, but of predatory panic. In the capital, the news of the defeat was treated not as a national crisis to be managed, but as a political opportunity to be seized. The Byzantine zeitgeist of the era was defined by a profound, almost pathological obsession with legitimacy and the preservation of the civil bureaucracy against the military aristocracy. To the Ducas clan, Romanos was not a tragic hero attempting to save the borders. He was a spent force, a failed usurper whose capture had conveniently vacated the throne.
In the corridors of the great palace, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and the whispers of eunuchs, the survival of the imperial borders was secondary to the survival of the ducas' grip on power. Consequently, led by the Caesar John Ducas and the cynical intellectual Michael Psellos, the government moved with a clinical ruthlessness to declare Romanos deposed. They replaced him with the young, scholarly, and entirely ineffective Michael VII, a move that effectively prioritized the immediate security of their faction over the long-term integrity of the state. This rejection of the peace settlement was the pivot point upon which the fate of the empire turned. When the news reached Romanos that he had been declared a non-person by the very Senate he had fought to protect, the causality chain of disaster was set in motion. He was no longer a sovereign negotiating a ransom. He was a pretender leading a shadow government. The Sultan, realizing that the treaty he had signed was now worthless paper, was forced to view the Anatolian interior no longer as a protected buffer, but as an open vacuum. The what-if of history looms large here. Had the Ducas clan waited only a few months, or had they accepted the financial burden of the ransom, the Turkish horsemen would have remained on the periphery. Instead, their coup turned Alp Arslan from an ally into an accidental conqueror. The Sultan didn't need to launch a formal invasion. He simply stopped restraining his local commanders. The human cost of this political maneuvering was felt first by those far from the palace walls. Consider a nameless Roman messenger, a man who had ridden days from the east carrying the signed treaty, believing he carried the salvation of his people. Upon reaching the gates of a provincial city, he would have found the standards changed and his news treated as treason. His journey, meant to herald peace, ended in a dungeon, a microbiography of a state that had begun to devour itself. For the common soldier and the Anatolian farmer, the rejection of the treaty meant the end of the world. As the Ducas faction and the supporters of Romanos descended into a bitter civil war, the gates of the frontier were left, literally and figuratively, unmanned. The Byzantine military, already fractured by the defeat at Manzikert, was now turned inward, fighting over the scraps of an empire that was being systematically dismantled by the very people sworn to lead it. The descent into civil war was swift and chaotic. Romanos, desperate to reclaim his throne, raised an army of loyalists and Turkish mercenaries, but he was eventually cornered, defeated, and subjected to the brutal Byzantine tradition of blinding. The forensic accounts of his end are harrowing. The process was performed so clumsily that he died shortly after from infection, clutching a letter from the Ducas government that mockingly assured him of their Christian forgiveness. This internal strife acted as a beckoning light to the Seljuk tribes. With the Roman central authority in a state of collapse and the peace treaty voided by the death of its signatories, the Turkish migration into Anatolia became an unstoppable tide. They were often invited in by one Roman faction to fight another, only to find that there was no longer any force capable of making them leave. The legacy of these few months in 1071 remains etched into the modern map of Eurasia. The failure to honor the ransom of an empire ensured that Anatolia would transition from the Greek-speaking heart of Byzantium to the Turkish-speaking cradle of the Ottoman future. It was not the battle itself that destroyed the empire, but the internal betrayal that followed it. The lines negotiated by Alp Arslan and Romanos IV Diogenes by candlelight in a silken tent were the last chance for a managed coexistence. When those lines were erased by the ink of the Ducas coup, the ancient world finally gave way to the medieval reality of the East. Today, the ruins of the fortresses mentioned in the treaty stand as silent witnesses to a peace that was rejected, a reminder that the greatest empires are rarely toppled by the enemies at their gates, but by the hands of those who sit on their thrones. The central plateau of Anatolia was more than a geographic expanse. It was the high-altitude heart of the Byzantine state, a vast reservoir of tax revenue, grain, and the sturdy infantrymen who had defended the cross for centuries. In the mid-11th century, this heart began to fail, not from a single catastrophic blow, but through a slow, systemic evaporation of authority. The defeat at Manzikert in 1071 is often cited as the definitive end, yet the forensic reality found in surviving administrative records suggests a far more insidious process. While the generals in Constantinople were preoccupied with the bloody arithmetic of succession, the infrastructure of the interior was being dismantled by neglect. Roads that had been maintained since the time of Augustus began to crack, and the postal stations, once the nervous system of the empire, fell silent as the funding for couriers was diverted to pay for the mercenary guards of usurpers. Driven by this internal fragmentation, the state's ability to project power beyond the city walls of Nicaea or Iconium vanished, leaving the local populations to face an encroaching reality for which they were entirely unprepared. By 1080, the psychological state of the Anatolian Greek was of profound abandonment. In the walled towns of the interior, there was a sense that the world had simply stopped listening to their pleas. This was an era where the concept of the state was inextricably linked to the person of the emperor, and when that figurehead became a rotating door of short-lived pretenders, the provincial identity fractured. The people were not just waiting for an invasion, they were mourning the death of a protection that had lasted 700 years. Consequently, the arrival of the Seljuk Turks was often less of a siege and more of a filling of a vacuum. The nomadic tribes did not always come with fire and sword. Frequently, they arrived with flocks and tents, settling in the gaps where the Roman tax collector had once stood. This demographic shift was not an overnight conquest, but a slow-motion flood that altered the linguistic and religious landscape of the plateau forever. Evidence of this decay is anchored in the lead seals found in the silt of abandoned market towns. These seals, once used to secure official correspondence between the themes and the capital, show a sharp decline in quality and frequency after the mid-11th century. A letter written at dawn by a minor official in the Armeniac theme describes a landscape where the law has become a memory and the fields are harvested by strangers. This forensic detail highlights the fragility of the imperial grip. Inevitably, the lack of security forced the peasantry into a brutal choice: stay and adapt to the new Turkic overlords, or flee toward the safety of the Aegean coast. Those who stayed began the long process of cultural synthesis, and those who fled brought with them the desperate energy of the dispossessed, flooding the coastal cities with mouths the empire could no longer feed. The pacing of this collapse shifted according to the geography. In the rugged mountains of the Taurus, the resistance was slow, deliberate, and characterized by long winters spent in fortified monasteries. But in the open plains, the change was fast and chaotic. Small raiding parties could bypass the remaining Roman garrisons, striking at the supply lines that kept the urban centers alive. Without the Anatolian horse pastures, the Byzantine cavalry, the famed cataphracts, lost their primary source of mounts. This loss was a catastrophic pivot point. Without a native horse supply, the empire was forced to hire expensive Western European knights, a decision that would eventually lead to the hollowed-out military that faced the later Crusades. The cost of these mercenaries necessitated even higher taxes on the remaining coastal provinces, creating a vicious cycle of economic exhaustion and social unrest that further weakened the central government. History is often a product of narrow margins, and the fate of Anatolia was no exception. Had the mercenary commander Roussel de Bayeux not attempted to carve out his own independent Norman state in the heart of Asia Minor during the 1070s, the imperial forces might have been able to consolidate a new defensive line. His rebellion forced the Byzantines to seek help from the Seljuks to suppress him, effectively inviting the wolf into the sheepfold to deal with the hound. This small, selfish decision by a Frankish soldier for fortune changed the trajectory of the entire region. It broke the last coherent Roman military presence in the interior, ensuring that when the empire finally tried to reclaim the plateau, there was no longer a loyal infrastructure to receive them. The alternative outcome, a stable Norman-led buffer state, remains one of the great what-ifs of medieval era. Amid these shifting maps, the human cost is found in the story of a nameless weaver from the city of Amorium. Records suggest she was part of a group that attempted to reach the coast in the winter of 1075. She would have carried only what she could fit in a small cart, leaving behind a house that had been in her family since the reign of Heraclius. Her journey through mountain passes choked with snow and the constant threat of banditry represents the millions of individual tragedies that constitute a demographic shift. She was not a soldier or a queen, but her flight was the true death of Roman Anatolia. When people like her left, the land ceased to be Roman in anything but name, becoming instead a frontier where the old laws no longer applied. The result of this silent exodus was the transformation of Byzantium from a continental superpower into a vulnerable maritime state. The loss of the Anatolian breadbasket meant that the empire was now forever dependent on the sea lanes and the volatile mercy of the Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa. This shift necessitated the First Crusade, as the emperors in Constantinople realized they could no longer recover their lost heartland without massive external aid. The geopolitical vacuum left by the evaporation of Roman authority in the interior created a wound that the West felt compelled to cauterize. The legacy of this demographic and administrative collapse is still visible today in the stark cultural and linguistic borders of the modern Eastern Mediterranean. The silence of the Anatolian plateau in the late 11th century was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of a civilization retreating from itself, leaving behind a landscape that would eventually become the foundation of a new and very different world. This permanent severance from the interior ensured that Byzantium would spend its final centuries as a ghost of its former self, a coastal remnant clinging to the edges of a land it no longer understood. The lines drawn by the fleeing peasants and the advancing nomads in those dark decades remain etched into the political geography of the modern age.